Nearly 4 years ago, my predecessor sent a violent mob to the U.S. Capitol. This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Today's Supreme Court today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. It's a dangerous precedent. Gutting voting rights and civil rights, to taking away a woman's right to choose, that undermines the rule of law of this nation.
Political battlefield. The United States Supreme Court has long been an influential figure in American society, with rulings spanning a wide range of issues such as religious liberty, armed control, environmental protection, and civil rights. Although the 9 unelected justices of the Supreme Court have the power to serve for life without being elected, their influence in national politics has been growing in recent years. At the end of its 2023-2024 term, the Supreme Court decided to end a question of lasting significance posed by Chief Justice John Roberts. It ruled that former presidents, including Donald Trump, enjoyed broad but not absolute immunity from criminal prosecution related to their acts while president. In contrast to Trump's celebration of the ruling as a big win for democracy, Biden condemned it as a terrible disservice to Americans and an affront to the American legal system. The once respected and stately Supreme Court has become a political flashpoint. Let's examine this phenomenon. To put it plainly, the U.S. laws are guarded by the Supreme Court. It is up to the justices to determine whether or not federal policies and statutes are constitutional, and they determine if the laws established by Congress are being properly implemented by interpreting them. The legal concept of stare decisis, Latin for to stand by a decision, states that lower courts are obligated to adhere to the precedent established by the Supreme Court. Consequently, its choices are significant on a national and long-term level. The majority of cases that end up before the Supreme Court have made their way up the appeals ladder, either in lower federal courts or state courts. The number of petitions received by the Supreme Court exceeds 7,000 annually. However, only around 100 cases are heard during each term. When 4 out of 5 justices think the case has merit, the case goes to the Rule of 4 for examination. It is the intention of the founders that the judiciary and its members remain immune to political influence and judicial activism. No one in the United States votes for judicial candidates. After the president nominates a justice, the Senate must ratify their appointment. The only way to remove them from office is through impeachment, and they serve indefinitely or until they choose to resign willingly. There has been a single impeachment effort by Congress, and it was unsuccessful over 2 centuries ago. In actuality, the judicial system makes the selection of a justice one of the most weighty presidential decisions. With 6 justices serving at now, conservatives have a commanding majority. Trump nominated 3 of them: Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, and Neil Gorsuch. John Roberts, Samuel Alito, and Clarence Thomas were all nominated by Republican Presidents George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. Obama himself nominated 2 of the 3 liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. Mr. Biden selected Ketanji Brown Jackson. Appointments have been influenced by politics since the very beginning of this country, added Jonathan Entin, a law professor from Ohio's Case Western Reserve University who studies the Supreme Court. The courtroom dynamics have been altered, however, by the partisan polarization of the present day. Democrat presidents tended to appoint Democrats, and Republican presidents tended to appoint Republicans, according to him. What's changed is that the parties themselves have become more polarized. People in both parties have paid particular attention to judicial ideology going forward, he said. So it's much more contentious than it used to be. Only since 2022 has the court maintained its present composition, with conservatives predominating on the bench. Starting with the repeal of the constitutional right to abortion in June of that year, it has caused a significant upheaval in the country in that brief period. Federal prosecutors overreach when they use an obstruction statute against January 6 rioters. A ban on federal bump stock devices for arms was struck down, and an effort to restrict access to the abortion pill, mifepristone, was rejected, all within the last few weeks along with presidential immunity. Additionally, it undermined the authority of federal agencies like the EPA by reversing a prior decision that judges should follow federal agencies' lead when interpreting vague portions of legislation. Many powers will be transferred from federal agencies to the court system as a result of this decision and other recent verdicts concerning regulations. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned long-standing affirmative action policies in the U.S. last year, striking down President Joe Biden's plan to eliminate billions in student debt and stating that Harvard and UNC could no longer use racial admissions criteria. Behind the scenes, the Supreme Court takes great pains to conceal its internal discussions. Practically all of its operations, including reviewing briefs and circulation, occur behind closed doors. The nation was taken aback when word of the Dobbs decision, which reversed Roe v. Wade, leaked to the media due to the seemingly insurmountable nature of its process. The same holds true for face-to-face discussions. They are confidential and staff members are not invited. At a long table, the justices are arranged accordingly to seniority and each has a book and a notepad. Former Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer stated earlier this year in an interview with the BBC that they then have a real discussion regarding issues. In a case, starting with the Chief Justice, each justice expresses his or her legal view and explains why he or she is convinced or not by different arguments. No one speaks twice until everyone has spoken once, he pointed out. If you try to make a point saying that my argument is better than yours, that'll get you nowhere. But if you listen to what other people are saying and then at the end of the first round you pay attention and say that you have a point there, but I think it would be better if we did this, then you have a real discussion about it, according to him. The court has been increasingly accused of becoming more politicized and partisan as it has taken on landmark decisions and reversed decisions that were in place for decades. The percentage of Americans dissatisfied with the court's performance hit 58% in September, the highest monthly total in almost 20 years, according to Gallup. Justice Alito's family flies flags that are seen as symbols of the Capitol rioters at his home, while media have examined Justice Thomas for failing to disclose gifts, leading to heightened outcries over judicial ethics. The court issued a code of conduct last year, marking a first in its history. However, there is currently no system in place to enforce the code, and many, including prominent MPs, are demanding more robust changes. They have proposed term limits, an independent ethics office, a binding code of ethics, more judges for subordinate courts, and more judges overall. Despite widespread public disapproval, some have suggested increasing the number of justices on the bench. Staggered 18-year term limits, according to reform advocate Maggie Jo Buchanan of Demand Justice, might depoliticize the court, making it more balanced and representative of the U.S. population, as she told the BBC. In that way, every president would have the same number of appointees, according to her. That would ensure that the Supreme Court better reflects the will of the people. Right now, the Supreme Court's appointments are happening politically, whether from time of retirement or an unexpected demise, said Mrs. Buchanan. In a Supreme Court that has such power over our rules, a one-term president shouldn't have more appointments to the bench than a two-term president. Structural reforms, according to other experts, are neither feasible nor popular as they would necessitate a constitutional modification. There is a lot to be said for stability, stated Clark Neely, Senior Vice President of Legal Studies at the Cato Institute, a libertarian-leaning think tank based in Washington, D.C. that advocates for small government. Even though an institution's methods are flawed, there are many good reasons to keep them in place, he continued. A former litigator and co-counsel in a 2008 Supreme Court case that struck down an armed ordinance in the District of Columbia, Mr. Neely stated that any organization that has the last word on the Constitution is likely to inevitably produce controversy. That's something you can't escape, he stated. And I don't think that anybody has really presented a proposal that seems clearly likely to do better than what we have now.
We all saw it with our own eyes. We sat there and watched it happen that day. The ransacking at the Capitol, attack on the police, mob literally hunting down the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America. The American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election. Now, because of today's decision, that is highly, highly unlikely. Today's Supreme Court decision, once again, it will depend on the character of the men and women who hold that presidency, because the law will no longer do it. Any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law.
Major cases. Overturning the Chevron concept, criminalizing anyone sleeping outside, and restricting the statute used by prosecutors in cases involving rioters implicated in the January 6 Capitol attack are the three opinions that the U.S. Supreme Court has announced. The verdict may have far-reaching consequences for the federal criminal prosecution of Donald Trump and the assault on the Capitol in 2021. Grants Pass, Oregon, which had previously passed ordinances forbidding camping and sleeping in public parks and streets, also gained a victory when the court determined that western U.S. cities can penalize the act of unhoused persons sleeping outside. Monday, the court will deliver its final verdicts, which will address Trump's assertion of total immunity. In four matters that were argued during the term, the court has not yet issued decisions. In addition to legalizing abortions in extreme cases in Idaho, the court has rejected a bankruptcy settlement plan for Purdue Pharma, blocked the SEC's ability to combat securities fraud, and halted the EPA's initiatives to decrease dangerous air pollution. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.